I just want to say this. Abraham Lincoln. Okay, here's how it is. Abraham Lincoln, savior of the Union, destroyer of the public, greatest president ever, and 19th century Twitter troll. That's what he was.
Dad bod history, yeah. Hey, pretty yeah.
Welcome to Dad Bod History Podcast, Episode 1. We've somehow ended up on Abraham Lincoln as our topic, with the Civil War being the theme. So I'm going to read this quote from the Cooper Union speech of February 27th, 1860, before Abraham Lincoln is candidate for the Republicans. He writes this in his speech, which is his longest speech, just over 7,000 words. Under all these circumstances, do you really feel yourselves justified to break up this government unless such a court decision as yours is shall be at once submitted to as a conclusive and final rule of political action? But you will not abide the election of a Republican president. In that supposed event, you say, you will destroy the Union. And then, you say, the great crime of having destroyed it will be upon us. That is cool. A highwayman holds a pistol to my ear and mutters through his teeth, stand and deliver, or I shall kill you. And then you will be a murderer.
Yeah.
That's probably my favorite line in there. And the fact that he says, that is cool. I understand in the 1800s that means something different. Like that is cold-hearted, but that is cool.
Yeah, I read that and I thought the exact same thing. I was like, man, he was, in this whole speech, he's just owning Stephen Douglas. But that particular paragraph where he says that, it reminds me of in our modern day elections, right? When whoever wins, so if Trump wins, all the Democrats are like, I'm moving to Canada, or California is going to secede from the Union because we don't like the results of the election.
Or democracy is dead.
Or yeah, it's like, no, it's over. We're done for. Or, or Texas trying to secede from the Union as well. And like anytime we get an election we don't like, we're like, well, the losing side's like, I'm done. Let's just all throw it out and start over.
And it's that polarization. If it's this, it's also this. Mm-hmm. If you want to open the economy, you want my grandmother to die.
Yeah.
If you want to save my grandmother, it's going to come at the cost of the entire global economy, and everyone will die. And that's kind of what he points to.
It's totally what he points to. And it's funny, we like to think of people in the 1860s as a little bit more distinguished or reserved, but they're just as petty and dumb as we are. It's not like we've gotten worse. We just have more media to show how stupid we are. Like the whole thing, and he, prior to this, he's framing how the southern states and the representatives from the southern states are threatening, basically, if we don't get what we want, we will leave the Union. And if you don't vote the way we want, it's going to happen. And so Lincoln's saying, look, we can't negotiate with terrorists. We can't negotiate with these guys. There's no reason with them. There's no reasoning with them. There's no meeting them in the middle. They want all or nothing. At one point in the speech, he says, it's not even if, well, yeah, we think slavery's bad and you guys think it's right and we'll just leave each other alone. He goes, even if we tried to do that, we have been doing that, and that's still not enough for them. It won't be enough for them until we say, yes, slavery is right.
Yeah, so I made a note on that paragraph I think you're talking about, where he talks about what's going to convince them. What if we say slavery is not, we have to stop calling it wrong. We have to, and I basically said, this is, he's saying, unless we completely change our language on slavery, they won't be convinced. We're not going to convince these Southerners that that we're not going to take out slavery. We can't convince them. Mm-hmm. And he does say in there, listen, this is, I think, where he lays out his platform of, we're not here to get rid of slavery. The Republican idea is to not maintain the status quo, but to prevent the spread.
Yep.
And he kind of leaves it at that. And I think that's where he lays down the Republican idea of, we're not going to continue and spread this thing that we don't like. But we're also not going to destroy it outright.
Yeah, and he said, he quoted Jefferson saying basically that emancipation should be left to the states, so that over time, each state should decide to emancipate their slaves, and we should have a confederacy of free men. At the beginning of this speech, he's talking about Stephen Douglas, who, those of you that don't know, him and Douglas had, Abraham Lincoln and Douglas had these famous debates. I think they both ran against each other for the Senate in 58, and then Lincoln defeated Douglas in 60 for the presidential nomination or election. And so he starts his speech by calling out Douglas, and this is after they had these famous debates. And he says, in his speech last autumn at Columbus, Ohio, as reported in the New York Times, Senator Douglas said, the liberal New York Times, just so you know, Senator Douglas said, our fathers, when they framed the government under which we live, understood this question, slavery, just as well and even better than we do now. And so that's Douglas saying that. And so what Lincoln does is he goes, you know what? Stephen Douglas is right. They did understand better than we do now. And they did, and so he accepts the premise of Douglas. He goes, I fully endorse this and adopt it as text for this discourse. I so adopt it because it furnishes a precise and agreed starting point for a discussion which Republicans and the wing of the democracy, headed by Senator Douglas, it simply leaves the inquiry. What was the understanding that those fathers had of the question mentioned? And the question specifically was, does the federal government have a constitutional right or authority to control slavery in federal territory? And so then he spends the next 3 pages kind of breaking out, who are these founding fathers? And he calls them the signers of the Constitution, the 39 signatories. And then he goes, and what is the framework of the government, being the Constitution? And then he goes through that, and he just keeps citing time after time that after the Constitution was written, where framers were voting on the restriction of slavery, the Northwest Territories, which we now know as the Midwest, the Louisiana Purchase, what eventually became Missouri and the Missouri Compromise, all these situations. And every single time he makes a point, he goes back to the line where Stephen Douglas said, these forefathers understand this question just as well, if not better than we do. Basically, and that's why I'm calling him like a troll. Like he's trolling Douglas by saying, you said it. You said the 4 founding fathers knew this better than we do, and here's what they said on the issue.
Yeah, and he's bringing up all the framers' original tweets, right? He's like, here's
Exactly.
what they did. Here's how they did it. Here's what they voted on in this circumstance, or this circumstance, or this circumstance. And in this case, a majority of the framers voted this way. And in every case, it comes out that 21 of the 36 framers consistently voted against any spread of slavery, which is, again, the question, not to abolish slavery completely or adopt it completely, but do we contain the spread of slavery, especially when it comes to federal territories, not states? And then it gets into all the question of, what is a state? And he actually gets into that in his other speech that we're going to look at.
Yep. But in this speech, he kind of lays the case in the first half, saying, yes, the U.S. government does have the right to restrict slavery in its territories, and the reason in certain times that they didn't ban slavery was because either the territory that they acquired already had slavery, and to prohibit it would have been, I don't know if
a change in the law,
difficult or pragmatic. It would have been hard to reverse that. But they could say any new territory that didn't already have slavery they could restrict the slavery, the expansion of slavery to those new territories, which is why the Midwest, like Wisconsin, Michigan, part of Minnesota, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, all were free states. And then Louisiana, which was purchased from the French, Louisiana was already they already had slaves in Louisiana when they purchased it from the French, so they kept it as such. But when they bought the rest of the Northwest Territory, the Pacific Northwest Territory from the purchase, I believe that all remained free because there were no slaves at the time. So it's just interesting how he frames it. He sets up this long discussion using Douglas's words to kind of defeat Douglas's own argument. And then to the quote that you had at the very beginning, kind of setting it up, saying, look, you can change some action, but you can't change your behavior. And even if you got rid of the Republican Party, he says later, it wouldn't change the momentum that's happening, and it wouldn't change the sentiment of the people.
Yeah, and that's a big I guess, question as to Lincoln's presidency. How necessary was it to do certain things? And when we look at it in the context of slavery, which was a massive violation of rights, what other rights were we willing to sacrifice, even temporarily or even permanently, to remove that? And understanding that a good chunk of the population maybe didn't agree that that was a right that needed to be extended. There's another quote in here that kind of goes along with what I read before, and it was, he says, "Your purpose then, plainly stated, is that you will destroy the government unless you be allowed to construe and enforce the Constitution as you please. On all points in dispute between you and us, you will rule or ruin in all events." And it's that all or nothing mentality that he's pointing to, understanding that if we look at Lincoln in the context of slavery and the slavery debate, he would be considered, I almost would say, a moderate, in that he's like, slavery can continue where it exists currently, and where it doesn't, it won't. And that is not as extreme as many abolitionists and people who oppose slavery would want him to be, but it's far too radical for the people in states that allow slavery, knowing that their economy would be disrupted greatly by that.
Yeah, and it's funny, that Jefferson quote, I go back to because he said the eventual goal is that states abolish slavery individually, and so that they can, like, the evil will be insensibly removed until all those slaves are replaced by free white labor. And this whole idea that and a bunch of states had emancipated on their own. They didn't need the federal government to do it. And that's what most of the northern states did. But that was in Jefferson's mind, and to another extent Lincoln's mind, is that over time each state will realize how bad slavery is, and they will abolish it on their own without any prompting or force by the government. It's just I don't know, it's just wild how, like you said, they'll destroy the government if they don't. They'll rule or ruin everything, and it's just so funny to me because I think, like I said, with modern elections, like when Bush won in 2000 and 2004, especially in 2000 because he didn't win the popular vote, and a bunch of Democrats were like, "Well, I'm moving to Canada, or we're going to secede from the Union," and it's like, and then
none did.
When Obama won in 2008, and everybody in Texas is like, "Well, we'll just declare we're a republic again," and it's like, yeah, are you though? Because I don't think that's going to happen. But
it takes a lot of effort to secede.
Yeah, say this about the South. They followed through. I mean, they didn't just threaten it; they did it. Here we are.
Coming
cleaning
back
up 160 years later.
To his speech, he's talking about them saying, "Hey, we're going to roll this whole thing over. We're going to secede." Just full disclosure, we're not like Abraham Lincoln experts. Civil War was never my area of expertise. But as I look more into this, the first secessions happened at the end of 1860 after the election, and then they continued up until and past the inauguration in April of 1861. So he's calling this out a year before these secessions even happened, before he's elected. So he's got this foresight to say, this is what they're threatening. So that must have obviously been part of discussion. But then we go into, he's elected in 1860. He wins that election. Other states secede. And then in April, when all those states have seceded and he's being inaugurated, then we get into the Civil War. And that's where Confederate soldiers fire on and take Fort Sumter in South or North Carolina. They take Fort Sumter. Nobody is killed until after the battle, when a munition box explodes and kills a Union soldier because they've surrendered. And then there's a series of battles. We kind of saw some of those between then and July 4th, 1861, which is the other speech we're going to look at, where he's in front of Congress for a special session. And again, I wish that our presidents had the brevity of Lincoln. His longest speech is 7,000 words. This one, again, it's longer than the Gettysburg Address, but you can read it in about 5 minutes. And he's talking to Congress about all this. And And when we have those two ideas of Lincoln, savior of the Union and destroyer of the Republic, he talks a lot about the Constitution in that first speech. And in the special session, he's also talking a lot about the Constitution, which I actually appreciate a president looking to the Constitution, even if, in the end, Lincoln does kind of trample all over it in order to do something. And I'm not saying what he did was poor or bad. I mean, saving the Union matters, and he talks about it in this speech. But it became necessary in some respects for him to kind of step on the Constitution in a number of ways in order to get the means. And he even mentions it in this speech. He says towards the end, but if a state may lawfully go out of the Union, having done so, it may also discard the Republican form of government, so that to prevent its going out is an indispensable means to the end of maintaining the guarantee mentioned. And when an end is lawfully and obligatory, the indispensable means to it are also lawful and obligatory. So what he's saying there is, in order to save the Constitution, it may be necessary, whatever the means are to save it, are the appropriate means to save it. Which, while I agree with him in that circumstance, that's some dangerous language for our Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because then anybody can use that to, with ill intention, can use that to justify their actions. Well, I'm doing it to save the Constitution, and we see that so often with presidents today. Like they'll say, well, this obviously I'm doing this because I'm protecting your liberty. Like that's why I have to
or your safety.
Abridge your liberty to protect your other liberty, and it's like, well, not really. So I think that's
and his special session does something else when he talks so much about the states, and the states not really being states. And again, that word states is synonymous with country or nation. And prior to the Civil War, we have this term where they always say, these United States. And afterwards, it's always the United States. And that's a tiny change. But, he talks about the states as if they are not independent of the republic, or the federal government, the nation. Mm-hmm. Which I would say is an important distinction. But have either of you ever been to the Alamo?
Mm-mm.
Nick,
no.
You've been to the Alamo, right?
I think we passed through there, right? You and I. It's the only time I've ever been in that area. We were in San Antonio on a Greyhound bus, Eric.
That's right.
It was really a memorable time, I can tell.
Riding in style.
So yeah, we didn't visit the Alamo. Did we go like downtown? We just hung out at the airport.
Did you guys just get pissed off at the Spurs? Is that what happened?
We were already upset.
Yeah, we were
with the Spurs.
railing about the Spurs.
Okay. No, we got into San Antonio at like 4 a.m. and then went directly to the airport. So if you back to the point, the Alamo. If you ever go to the Alamo, in their main hall, they have a flag from each state or country from which a fighter at the Alamo came from. So there's a German flag, there's an Irish flag, there's a British flag, there's a Scottish flag, there's like a flag of Georgia and a flag from New York and a flag from various states, and then there's a streamer or ribbon for each. So there's 4 guys from New York who fought at the Alamo. So there's 4 streamers on the flag of New York. So the idea here that Lincoln says these states all proceed from the nation is something that even during the Civil War we see is kind of not true. People identify themselves as the state they're from. That's why, Robert E. Lee is going to say, no, I fight for Virginia, because he's a Virginian, not an American in his mind. And so, at the Alamo, you can see that. It's very tangible to see. These people consider themselves an Alabaman or a Georgian or a North Carolinian or a Virginian, and they've come to Texas to fight, or a Texan, because some were already living in Texas, or a German or an Irish, and they're fighting for their independence in Texas. So,
and I think the point that Lincoln was making is, even at the very inception of the United States, when they declared independence from England, they did it in a correct me if I'm wrong, they had to be unanimous in that vote to declare independence on July 4th. The 13 colonies did. And I think, so to him, he's like, no, even when we started, even though we were 13 colonies, we made a unanimous decision as a nation. And so the states stopped being independent of one another. And after the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, that became even more pronounced. And then at any state that joined the Union later was always, so like the North, like the territories that became the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, and them, they were already a part of the United States territory, so they're already part of that one.
Or they were
And
taken
then,
from a current state and broken
Yeah.
off. But yeah, the colonies were, they declared their independence not as 13 colonies, but as one nation.
Yeah. And so he was making the point that, yes, they were 13 colonies, and we've added states and territories since then, but it's always been under the understanding that you're not your own nation that's joined. I think the comparison would be the European Union, where you have
Right.
a collection of 20 to 30 nations, and they can work together, but they can also just leave.
But they
And
also joined of their own volition.
Yeah.
As Germany existed, and Germany said, well, we're going to join.
Yeah. Whereas Spain sold Florida to the United States, or France sold Louisiana Purchase to the United States. And you can say the natives, none of them agreed with any of these sales and purchases, and that's totally
Yeah.
true. But for the purpose of this argument, he was saying, look, you were never your own nations. And he goes, and the only exception maybe is Texas. But even then, when Texas joined, they had to basically give up this idea that they were a separate country or a separate state joining in a coalition, and they were joining a union.
Yeah,
And that's the point he makes in that speech to the Congress.
he even says, even if the state has in its own constitution, hey, you can secede, that's null and void. Like, it doesn't matter. The state's constitutions are all going to fall under the law of the land, which is the national
United
constitution.
States Constitution. Yeah.
So, but yeah, I'd say these speeches, the Gettysburg Address is great for like fifth graders to memorize and recite, and it's powerful for the event that occurred. But when looking at a platform and looking at this is what republicanism is, even if it was at his time, we don't even need to tie it to Republicans today. There's one line in his first speech that really sums it up, and maybe it's where was that? Because it was probably the best line that kind of set aside what what was the difference between Republicans and others.
We'll cut this in post, right, Nick?
Sure.
Me and Eric shuffling through a bunch of papers.
Some
we
of it's
talk-
interesting, but most of it's not.
He talks about the rebellion being sugar-coated and they're drugging the public. Like some of his language there about, how these people are being duped into seceding. That's really interesting. But here I found it. He said this. He says, this is essentially a people's contest. On the side of the Union, it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men and women, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life, yielding to partial and temporary departures from necessity. This is the leading object of the government for whose existence we contend. Like that is a classical liberal argument for the point of government. It's there to remove obstacles for people to be their best selves. And he says, he does have that one caveat, yielding to partial and temporary departures from necessity. Mm-hmm. That's the goal of government. That's the goal of a union like this. It's to remove all the burdens that people have so that they can do, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, and you say that, and it's so funny. Is I think a good example is toll roads, right? When a state needs to build new roads, and they say, well, we're going to put a toll in so we can pay for the road, and when the road's paid off, we'll remove the tolls. When's the last time a toll has ever been removed after the road has been paid off, right?
Well, when's a law
And the
ever
same,
been removed?
exactly, that's the same thing. And I think Lincoln is saying, look, in certain cases, we will need to abridge your rights or whatever it is, but that should only be temporary and only for the purpose of preserving something greater, in the case of the Constitution or the Union. But now it's so rare that you see any sort of law like the Patriot Act. Remember that was instituted after the attacks in 2001. Well, that's it's still there, and it's still abridging your right to privacy and your right to property, and it's gotten worse since then. But we were told we needed it for safety, and it's probably never going to go away. But then, taking a little departure, looking at some of these lines, especially in the Cooper speech, you can actually like see Lincoln, like the personality in the man, and not just like the stoic picture on the $5 bill. Like you can see him come alive. Like he goes, I defy any man to show that any one of them ever in his whole life declared that in his understanding any proper division of local from federal authority or any part of the Constitution forbade the federal government to control as to slavery and in the federal territories. And then later on, a couple paragraphs later, he shifts his speech and he goes, and now, if they would listen, as I suppose they will not, I would address a few words to the Southern people. Like he just gets into it. And it's like we have this like austere picture of Lincoln where he's just always so serious and he's always like so controlled, and like because we don't see him, but you can see in his words like this was a fiery guy, and this was a guy that like kind of liked to get into it and basically say, okay, give me your best shot. Let's see what you got if you think you're so right.
When we look at Lincoln, he is. We look at his upbringing. He is that kind of up by his bootstraps. Failed multiple times. Failed Senate elections. Failed at business. From the backwoods of Illinois. Started business on his own. He is not a politician from political roots.
Yeah.
He hasn't even been politically...
Yeah, he's not a blue blood. He's not upper crust.
Right. He hasn't been politically successful even. So I guess part of me is like, what would it be like to witness any of his speeches? Because we always get that, reserved kind of, he was reserved and quiet. It's like, I can't imagine when talking to 1,500 people without a microphone about something like this, that he's going to be reserved. Mm-hmm. Because these are things that he's passionate about. This was his platform, which was the Union stays whole. But here's what we stand on slavery, and it matters. And he's taken a constitutional look at it, and it's I can't imagine him doing so in a reserved, stoic mm-hmm. manner.
Well, and he must have been amazing because at this point, when he gives this speech, he's not a candidate for president, and Seward is. And then the Republican Party, after the speech, it goes, you know what? We're gonna change tack a little bit, and we're gonna go with this guy. And that's how conventions were back then. Is you could go into a convention supporting one guy, and then you ended up the nominee yourself. Like it was a totally different monster back then.
There's no Super Tuesday.
Yeah.
CNN and Fox News weren't broadcasting the votes as they came in.
Exactly.
And, even this speech, it wasn't recorded outside of the written record. And so people having the ability to sit down and read something all the way through and understand it and take from it the words themselves rather than just passion. So even if he wasn't passionate, you read these words and you're like, no, that's the platform. That's the idea that I can get on board with. Rather than just like, oh, I can get behind, build the wall. Okay, 3 words. I can remember that. Mm-hmm. No, they could get on board with this platform. So it's kind of interesting seeing these documents, speeches I had never looked at, didn't really know about.
And I think it was enlightening. It gave me a whole new appreciation for Lincoln and kind of who he was as a man. I do think it's interesting today, especially in this particular crisis, when you sent these and said these are kind of timely. You know, how at one time um, he goes, you guys consider yourselves reasonable and just people, yet still when you speak of us Republicans, you do not only denounce us as reptiles, or at the best, no better than outlaws. You will grant a hearing to pirates or murderers, but nothing like it to black Republicans. And the way he said that, and it's like, this is like when I'm on Twitter and I'm trying to argue about the reason we should wear masks for COVID-19 and someone calls me a socialist because I disagree with them. It's like they use it like, oh, that black Republican, or like in the Red Scare of the 50s, everybody's a commie. If you disagree with anything, the party line says you must be a commie. And Democrats in the South at this time were using this to, when they were being primaried by other Democrats, they go, oh, well, he's not a true Democrat. He's a black Republican. Like, that was the branding that you had. And just like, you know, Republicans today say, anybody that doesn't support Donald Trump is obviously a socialist. And anybody that doesn't support, I guess, the most liberal candidate is just
unfettered capitalist
someone
pig.
sucking on the corporate teat or something like that. They're just it's crazy how eerily similar it is to today, like the way people get labeled and sectioned, and if you are this, then you must be that. And it was just mind-boggling. Like, I could totally see if Twitter existed in the 1850s and 60s, it would be just as toxic as today.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same issues. And so, you know, people, oh, we've never been this polarized. No, I think we were a bit more polarized in 1860 than we are now. And it was on an issue that affected so many people on an individual level, economically, or I guess you could say spiritually. You see something happening that is a moral wrong that is ongoing and upheld within the nation. That's gonna drive a wedge between people, and I don't think, outside of saying whatever you think about Donald Trump, I don't think we've ever seen anything like slavery. I can't imagine there's something that could drive a wedge between people in this country, much like slavery did. And it did it sectionally. It was easier because it was those Virginians, it was those South Carolinians, and those New Yorkers and those Yanks. But you know,
it's something
your neighbors that you disagree with.
We're still dealing with the fallout of that. Like, you know, there is no, like you said, there's nothing that's ever been like slavery in the United States, and God, I hope there's nothing ever like it again, because it's been 165 years and we're still dealing with the fallout of the Civil War.
Which brings up the other question, and so that brings up a great question about Lincoln, but which is this: Lincoln doesn't get assassinated. Lincoln survives. Is Lincoln, because he's got a full term ahead of him?
I don't think that's accurate historically.
So let's.
No, he made it, Nick.
Oh, got it.
Him and Elvis.
He became like a vampire.
You guys are the
afterwards.
experts. I mean,
so no, I said we're not. We're not the experts. We're pretty amateur at this.
I've read 2 articles. I feel pretty well versed now. So.
If he survives and he does not become assassinated, and he has got a full term ahead of him, rather than Andrew Jackson, right, who came after him, Johnson. And you have all the backbiting, and you've got the radical Republicans. Now you have Lincoln still at the head. Is he able to mend the wounds of the Union in a way that prevents this 150-year struggle to get out of the wreckage of the Civil War?
I don't know if he prevents it. And honestly, I think if he had stayed alive, the Reconstruction would have been more complete. But no, I think the wounds were always going to be long, and they were always going to be deep. You don't just get over that. I think that's why, honestly, he and Jefferson and those like them are like, we want states to emancipate individually because, and I can't find it in here, because Jefferson said, if it were to force itself to continue slavery, we couldn't imagine the cost or how bad it would be. But to force the states not to, have slavery, which, while I think was a good thing, and obviously the end of slavery was a good thing, I think Lincoln and those like him were saying, no, Virginia, no, Georgia, you need to emancipate your slaves on your own volition, because that will be better for the country, and it will be better for those now freed slaves as a whole if you choose to do this instead of being forced to. You won't have the Jim Crow laws. You won't have the rise of the KKK, because your people, the people of Georgia, decided, no, what we're doing is wrong and we need to stop it. Or whatever slaveholding state at the time. And I do think if Lincoln had survived, it would have been a better Reconstruction, but I think it still would have been...
You still have a war behind you.
Yeah,
And that,
you'd still be dealing with this.
yeah. So here's the
an
last
extent.
line that I loved. You mentioned it in that text the other night before I had read this. The ballots are the rightful and peaceful successors of bullets. And that when ballots have fairly and constitutionally decided there can be no successful appeal back to bullets, that there can be no successful appeal except to ballots themselves at succeeding elections. Such will be a great lesson of peace, teaching men that what they cannot take by an election, neither can they take it by a war, teaching all folly of being the beginners of a war. The ballots being the successor to bullets. That's a really cool line.
That was a really good... And that was the special session?
Yeah, he's talking to Congress.
Yeah, that was a great line. It was... it's something that you can kind of hold on to and say, look, we as a society or people, we are better than this. And we need to, even when we don't like the results of a fair election, we need to accept them because it's better than the consequence. And I think in that speech he also says, right makes might.
Yeah,
Where
he
so
does.
many people like to say might makes right. He says, no, right makes might. Like, right is what matters. It doesn't matter
And it makes you
how
stronger.
strong you are. Yeah, it doesn't matter how strong you are physically. That doesn't make you right. But being right, that will give us a strength as a nation.
Yeah, and to put this speech, this was July 4th, 1861, so you had the Battle of Fort Sumter. You had a series of small battles. And when I say small, I think the largest one had 1,000 men in it. We're talking like casualties in the 10 to 20s killed, maybe 50 wounded, all these little skirmishes. So this is effectively his December 7th speech by FDR. You know, it's we're at war. They attacked us. They had the first volley at Fort Sumter. We've had a few altercations since then. This is what's necessary to make this right. And we're going to have to, you know, they seceded. We have to go get them back. And that's
And I think a lot of people forget this is still a precarious time for the United States. They're not even a century old. And I think in the same year, 1861, Britain says, yeah, the Confederate States are a legitimate nation.
well. So I looked into that. It's the Neutrality Proclamation of 1861.
Yeah.
Basically, what they said that was in May of 1861. So that's between Fort Sumter. It's between Fort Sumter and this speech. And what they said is, recognizing that there is a conflict of arms, we are going to stay neutral. And what they did, they didn't recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation, but as a legitimate belligerent, which it's different. But it says, listen, we understand that that's a group of people who are fighting against this other one. We're not recognizing them as a nation, but we're also not going to take the side of the one that we consider a legitimate nation. Because the British also knew that they had something to benefit if this war breaks these nations apart successfully, that they do have a cotton connection, which actually the Confederacy found out later was not, the British didn't need their cotton. They weren't willing to run the blockade to get the cotton. It wasn't that important to them. So, yeah, Lincoln, good stuff.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, let's move on.
We'll be back after these commercials from Turkey Jerky.
I made my own jerky last week.
Did you?
Yeah.
Was it good?
Oh, it's excellent. I've been making it for a few months now. But the meat price went up. It was like $6.99 a pound for this jerky meat. I went back last week. It was $10 a pound. And I'm like, come on. So now I think I got to get a food slicer and just go buy some top round or bottom round, slice it myself, and
Okay.
dehydrate it. So, yeah, I'll sell my jerky. I'll sponsor it. All right. So,
What's going on in the lives of these dads and teaching and stuff? What's going on there?
That's not on my notes, Nick.
going
I
on.
don't have a life.
I mean, it's got these three,
Yeah.
and they're wild. I got the one just jumping off tables, and he's the smallest. The other one's teaching
Are
him
we
how to
talking
do
about
it.
animals?
My
The
children.
new viewer.
So Marcus, my son, he that kid does not stop moving from the moment he wakes up until, I swear to God, 9:46 p.m. at night. Like, he is just constant motion. But I mean, they're doing good. They're doing about as well as I guess you could expect in a 2.5 month lockdown. But it's wearing on me, but it's definitely wearing on my wife a whole lot more than me. So, but they're doing good.
What's going on with yours, Eric? I think I hear one screaming in the background right now.
That might be mine.
Yeah, I don't hear any of mine. No,
Yeah, that's Marcus.
my wife took him upstairs. Just get him out of the hair. No, they're just out of my hair. We've got to do like the school stuff, right? So we're both teaching. We're both managing hours in the morning where we're available to students, and we're working on, school stuff, and we're trying to set ourselves aside. And the other one's got the three. We're trying to work through, third grade homework, which our third grader, she's pretty self-sufficient. Our kindergartner, it's like pulling teeth every morning. But then there's the days that are great for him, and it's great. And then we have a 2.5-year-old running around trying to distract everyone. So, about 5 o'clock we wind down, and everyone just falls asleep in the living room.
Yeah.
I need a more specific story.
I don't have any more specific stories.
Have anything interesting? Like your kids?
So I
fell in the
bought
pool,
my
you had to
two
pull
older
one out
ones
and
bows, like archery, and
put it on the speaker.
no, and so we were doing some archery early on in the pandemic in the backyard, getting the kids ready for the
Survival skills.
Yep.
Good.
And if a large white squarish animal walked up to them, they would miss it completely.
Like a really fat sheep.
Yeah, with a target on its side, they'd miss it. And they've got no poundage
Good
behind the
deal.
bow; it bounce off the fur or the wool. So it's not, And then it's like the other day we have this big box of Legos, just huge. And I love Legos, and I've tried to. It's just a big box of all the Lego sets, just broken up. And so the 2.5-year-old Liam, he just goes in there and just starts throwing Legos. And so there's like Legos everywhere. We just get the broom and sweep them up. And just like, all right, Legos in here, everything else in here. It's just every time I look at that box and I see him open the lids, I'm like, here we go again.
Yeah. Nothing.
What has
Nothing.
Marcus broken in your home?
What hasn't he broken? We've got this little like beadboard that goes around our baseboards that was attached to this house that we moved into, and all this, it's not attached well, which is part of the problem. And all he does is he just goes around picking it up and he starts swinging it around, and it's got these like little tacks in it. So pretty much anything that can be a weapon is what he's going for right now. And yeah,
You guys need to switch. Like he needs to be doing the archery.
He's more hand to hand. He doesn't believe in distance attacks. He likes to get
what
up,
class is
up
he?
close.
What class is he?
Oh, he's a warrior.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
He's more into knife fighting.
yeah. So, but he's doing good. I mean, and Langston's doing good. Her school years, I think this is the last week of school at home, basically.
Yeah, this is our last week of new material. Next week, as far as teachers' perspective, this is the last week of new material. Last week of instruction. Next week is we can do assessments and stuff, and stuff can be turned back into us, but it's the last week of assigning new things. But it's just so weird. The whole thing is just weird.
Yeah.
Because, I don't get the same feeling of, and Jake, you remember that, of like the last couple weeks of school. It's just a little bit of bounce and excitement that, there's the wear and tear. That's usually in April, but in May, everyone just like feels it.
Yep.
And then you get to the last week, and then you get to the actual last week that's like a half week or whatever, and just everyone's all buzzed up and excited. And I'm looking forward to being at
You're
a
hugging
completion
kids
point.
that were the worst kids all year.
Yeah. But
Like,
I'm looking
everybody's
forward
happy.
to being complete and done with this school year, as I am with every year, but there's none of the excitement and fun that goes with it. It's very, it's just very different and weird. I really don't. The whole distancing was difficult. It was good because we learned and we grew. We learned to work with new technology and try new things. And some students took to it. Other students really struggled. So it was just a very different perspective on education.
Are you waiting? You ready for sports to come back?
Which sport? Professional? Yeah, let's jump to professional sports. So, yes.
Podcast is all over the place.
You'll fix it in post, Nick. I don't know
All
why.
say to me.
Fix it in post. Listen, talent's low. I can't fix that, guys.
Yeah.
No, so sports. MLB,
I think
NBA,
the baseball's got a 82 game schedule plan.
they've got a plan
for the summer.
but it's MLB owners, NBA owners, and they haven't really talked to the players yet. So the owners have a plan. Players don't know if they're involved.
The NBA had a call with players on Friday.
Yeah, but he was asking and answering questions.
There's a lot of optimism, I've heard. A lot of optimism.
Listen, I know MLB is looking at July 4th weekend to start. I don't know when NBA is. If NBA starts on Father's Day and just is playing games from 8 a.m. till 10 p.m., that's going to be the greatest gift to every father in this country. But Korean baseball, they've started back up, and ESPN's airing their games. I haven't watched any. But listen, if baseball is back first, I'm going to be hooked, and I'm not a baseball guy. So
I agree. I think whatever big sport comes back first is going to dominate the market.
that I don't have to pay for because I didn't watch UFC.
Yep.
But I heard a little bit about that UFC fight last weekend.
I heard it was a success.
Yeah, they thought it was one guy tested positive, so they sent him away. But they had the octagon. They had it in an arena, but the arena was empty. And I guess some of the fighters were saying, Joe Rogan is one of the commentators, and there's a couple other guys who are commentating. The fighters could hear what the commentators were saying, and they adjusted their fighting based on. They heard a commentator say, "Well, he should try this," and so the guy did, and it helped him. Because
That's awesome.
there's no
How does
crowd.
that play out in the NBA?
Well, fights are going to have to be. They have to allow more
Jeff
fights.
Van Gundy. Jeff Van Gundy is on the sideline, just going off about one of the players.
So here's a question: if they're going to play those games,
It's going to hurt their feelings, is what's going
in
to happen.
arenas, if they're going to play NBA games in arenas, that's the question: is are they going to still play the music? Because I hate the music. I know you hate it too, Nick.
Defense.
hate that.
Just that.
I do hate it.
Or dun 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 dun.
It's going to be like an Orlando resort thing where they
Kinda
shut
like-
down Disney World and all the hotels. They create like a bubble.
Kind of like they do that for the NBA. What's the summer league? Right? They're in these smaller spaces.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously, there's still
All you
one
need
thing.
is a court, and a court can fit in a hotel conference
and
room.
hotels.
Yeah, a hotel conference room can fit a whole court.
Yeah, so that's what they're talking about doing is like setting up a bunch of courts where all you need is like some cameras. You just build a bunch of courts and then you quarantine all these surrounding hotels, right? So then anybody who comes in has to be tested.
I think it's going to be cool if you can hear the players.
It better have those
Like,
sensor buttons ready.
you can hear the action in the game. Yeah. No, you definitely have the dump button.
I mean, Nick,
But-
you remember what it was. I mean, I don't know how much you were on the sideline during those Suns games. I remember friends of mine had like second row seats behind the visitors bench and hearing everything he did off
Shout
the
out
court.
to Trace.
Yeah, hearing everything you heard off the court, it was so much more enjoyable to hear the players, hear the coaches.
And you even hear the sneakers and hitting the wood, or just like all that ambient noise. Like it almost takes me back to high school, right? You can actually hear the action on the court, and I think, at least not permanently, but temporarily, I think that would be a kind of a cool aesthetic.
That and any new format they come with, whether it's a shorter playoff sets or shorter playoff series, which I don't think they'll go with. I think they'll stick with 7-game series, which bums me out.
Here's the
because
thing:
I
the
like
Bucks need to have this because this is the only chance they'll have to win a championship in the next 50 years.
They'll have
So
an asterisk, just so you know.
I'll take it.
Your Bucks do need this. He needs
Yes.
as many shots at it as he can get. Although I will
Yes.
say he might have an even better shot next year when LeBron is a year older.
That's true.
But you can never. Your point is like with the NBA, you can just never tell.
Yeah.
Sometimes you only get the one shot. It's easy to look at your team and go, we'll be back the next couple of years. But sometimes that just doesn't happen.
Yeah. So the Bucks need this. So is it Silver? Get your act together, Silver. But yeah, we need sports back.
Yeah.
Luckily, the NFL has the luxury of not having to come back until August or September.
I feel like they don't. The NFL is not really paying attention. They're like, "What happened? We had the Super Bowl. Everything's great. We did our draft." I know they did.
I saw an
virtually,
article and they're like, we'll just push it a couple months. like no biggie.
Dad bod history, yeah. Hey, pretty good. Yeah.